It's just a little after 7, and we're going to get started. I want to welcome everybody to the Norwich Bookstore, and a little bit of housekeeping and announcements before we begin. If you could turn off phones and other electronic devices, that would be great. What we'll do is I'll do a brief introduction, and then Peter will have the floor, and then the books will stay at the front counter with the homemade cookies and lemonade, and then you can bring your book back here to have it signed. It just makes the flow a little easier. I will be putting the chairs against the wall, or you can help. It's not to rush you out, it's just to make room for people to move around. And I do want to mention we have a really full, amazing calendar, actually now through July, actually through August now, and I'm scheduling the fall. Tomorrow night, Dee Dee Pursehouse is going to be speaking about her book on medical ecology. And on Saturday, Gail Gibbons, who we all probably grew up with, Gail Gibbons is coming on Saturday. She's never been to the bookstore, so she's coming as part of Children's Book Week to sign books Saturday morning. And then we have Stephen Kiernan reading from his novel, Jeffrey Lent, Michelle Campbell, and Bill Schubart. And then we have poetry with Pam Harrison. And Lizzie Boyd will be signing her new kids book, which is amazing. It's not out yet, but I got to see an advance copy. And then we're having a celebration of Grace Paley, because there's a new anthology of her writings, poetry and prose, and her daughter and the other editor of the book will be here. So that's just the stuff in the store in the next 2 months. And we encourage you to sign up for our newsletter and all that stuff so you don't miss anything. So tonight, we are honored to welcome Peter Heller back. He is an award-winning adventure writer and is the author of 4 highly acclaimed books of literary nonfiction. He's a longtime contributor to NPR and a contributing editor at Outside Magazine, Men's Journal, and National Geographic Adventure. And though he now lives in Denver, that's where he's still, right? Okay. People move. His connections to the region go back to high school in Vermont and college across the river at Dartmouth. He received his MFA in fiction and poetry from the Iowa Writers Workshop. And we were very lucky, sort of serendipitously, to have him visit when his first novel, Dog Stars, came out nearly 5 years ago. And then in 2014, The Painter was released, and now we have Celine, his 3rd novel, and it's getting amazing attention. It's easy to see how his adventure experiences influence his fiction writing in this new novel. One reviewer wrote it better than I could express it. He said that Peter is a master at describing the wonder and beauty of the natural world and in making setting and community an integral part of his stories. So without further ado, please help me welcome Peter Heller.
Yay! It's so great to be here. Wow, this is like this is home territory. So many friends in here. Oh, it's awesome. So I don't know. I kind of feel like just telling French Canadian jokes, but I won't. I'm going to actually read. I'm going to read because you like it. I think. And I think it's really great to get fiction read to you by the author, and you can sort of hear it in the voice that it came to me. So I will read a little bit. Bear with me. I won't read a ton. My favorite thing when I was a kid was my dad used to read me in bed every night before I went to sleep, and he had me on E.E. Cummings when I was 6. Sort of grounds for social services. If you think about it, some of those poems. I didn't understand them, but I loved the music of the language. He was reading me Yeats when I was like 11. I still remember Prayer for My Daughter. I've walked and prayed for this young child an hour and heard the sea wind scream upon the tower and under the arches of the bridge and scream. It's like when you're 11, awesome, sort of. I wanted to do that, and so I'll read you a little bit. I think I'll just start with the first chapter. There's a prologue, and I know you all will read it when you buy the book. And so I'll just start with chapter 1. The call had come while she was at her workbench, wiring the naked taxidermic form of an ermine onto a rock beside the skull of a crow. The plan was to have the skinless ermine looking down at his own hide tacked to the rock. Her sculpture had a distinctive dark streak. When Celine wasn't solving cases, she made pieces from anything at hand, which often involved skulls. The year before, the window washer had been fascinated by her art, which was displayed throughout the open studio, and the next day he brought her a human skull in a bucket. "Don't ask," he said. She didn't. She covered it immediately in gold leaf, and it stood now on a pedestal by the front door, looking elegant. Now she felt like this ermine. She felt skinned and lost, without protection. Her own fur had been her family. She had Hank, of course, but a son, no matter how old, was someone to be protected, not the other way around. When the phone rang, she almost didn't answer it, but then she thought it might be Pete calling from up in the Heights, needing grocery shopping help. "Hi, Celine Watkins?" "Yes?" "This is Gabriella Ambrosio Lamont." "Gabriella," she whispered, trying to place the name. "You don't know me. I went to Sarah Lawrence, class of '82. I saw the story about you in the alumni magazine, Prada P.I. Gabriella laughed, clear, bell-like. Celine relaxed. "That was silly," she said. "I mean the title. I've never worn Prada in my life." "Chanel doesn't alliterate." "Right." Celine closed her eyes. The name was distinctive and it sounded familiar. Hadn't the girl had her own small story in the magazine about a show of still life photographs in a gallery in San Francisco? Celine seemed to remember a portrait of the woman and bits of biography. She was pretty, maybe partly Spanish. Her father had been a photographer too, hadn't he? Famous and very charismatic. The story had interested Celine. "I remember you from an article." "Ha, the exclusive club of the alumni magazine Profiles," Gabriella said. "Yes." Pause. "I hope it's okay I called you out of the blue." Celine had been in her business a long time. She knew that nobody ever just called out of the blue. They had been on a certain trajectory for a while. They deliberated. They picked up the phone. They were like the pilots of small planes approaching an airport who called the tower finally for instructions to land. What Celine didn't know was if she had the strength. It was 1 year and 1 day after the Twin Towers had fallen. She could still almost smell the char, still see the air gritty with ash, and remember how the wind blew bits of charred financial statements and post-it notes across the river where they fluttered over the dock like lost confetti. She could not have imagined a sadder finale to a grim year. Her younger sister had died that May. She remembered how bright, how tender seemed the cottonwoods along the Big Wood River in Ketchum, Idaho, the morning Mimi left. She had helped her go. The handful of pills, the long kiss on the cheek. How she had walked down the drive. How the leaves spun in the wind, and how, when a gust came through, it swept the old trees to a darker green, like the hands of a harpist lifting a somber note off the strings. And then in July, she got word that her older sister Bobby had a brain tumor. It was a flare-up of a cancer, 5 years in remission. Celine went to Pennsylvania to visit, to help, and there was not much to do as Bobby died within 3 weeks. It was almost as if the youngest sister's death had given the eldest permission to take the deep rest she had longed for. And then the first plane hit, and Celine went to her window and watched the plume of black smoke rise into a clear sky. She was riveted. She lived 50 feet from the pier in an old brick loft building kitty-corner to the River Cafe. It was almost under the Brooklyn Bridge, Brooklyn side, 30 yards from the East River, and with the windows open she could hear the current rip and burble against the pilings of the dock. She pursed her lips and tried to get enough air. She did not move. Pete left her alone. When the second plane tore through the sister tower to the south, she shuddered as if it were she herself who had been slammed and ripped. Lying in bed that night while she cried silently beside him, Pete realized that Bobby was the north tower and Mimi the south. And of course the collapsing buildings were much more than that too. They were a burning message that a certain world had passed. Her sisters had been the last of the family she'd been born into. Celine's inner and outer world mirrored each other. Celine was 68 then. Her body was more frail than it should have been for an active, strong-willed woman as a result of 4 packs a day for 30 years, and though she had quit 10 years ago, the smoking had ravaged her lungs. She usually refused to wear oxygen. She was too elegant or vain. Celine Watkins was a private eye. She had what Mimi called the underdog bone. Celine always rooted for the weak, the dispossessed, the children, for the ones who had no means or power, the strays and homeless, the hapless and addicted, the forlorn, the remorseful, the broken. One couldn't count the skinny, trembling dogs her son ended up loving, or the chaotic families that stayed with them for days. The cases she took were for the lost causes, the ones who could never afford a PI. They were never about leverage or retribution or even justice, and they were often performed pro bono. They were usually about reuniting birth families. So she found the missing, the ones who could not be found. She gave a mother her lost son, a daughter her lost father, and her success rate was a staggering 96%, much better than, say, the FBI. She had worked for them too once, and she would never do it again. So, did I forget to thank the bookstore? Forgive me. Thank you, Liza, for having me back here. Not many people have me back more than once. It's awesome. Appreciate it. It's a really great watering hole. I love this store. Celine's partner in crime and in all other things in investigation is her husband, Pete, sort of her Watson. And Pete is a 7th generation Maine Islander from North Haven, where reticence is like the state bird. And so he doesn't say much. The family calls him the quiet American. And they together have some really powerful investigators. And Pete, growing up, acquired a lot of skills. He could build a small boat, he could pitch hay, he could cut wood, he could make a meal for 9 of his brothers and sisters when his mother was too busy. And now, living on the dock in Brooklyn, under the Brooklyn Bridge, he kind of channels his amazing energies and talents into investigation, but also into carving unabashedly erotic sculptures, which the cleaning lady refuses to dust. And he's an odd duck, and they make an incredible team because they're sort of like good cop, bad cop, except it's the cop that talks and the one who doesn't say anything. It's a potent combination. So I thought what I'd do is I'm going to read one more section, that's all. I'm not going to read any of that. There's a lot of action in the book, and the book, a lot of it's really funny. Take my word for it. But I'm not going to read you any of those parts because I don't want to, those are the scenes that, you don't want to give them away. So I'm just going to read you the boring parts, if you don't mind. I want to give you a feel for what it's like when they're driving together on the case. What happens is this young woman, Gabriella's father, went missing like over 20 years before up near Yellowstone. It was ruled death by bear. That's what the evidence seemed to indicate. This young woman feels like things didn't add up in the investigation. She thinks her father might still be alive, so she hires Celine to go find him. And so Celine calls her son Hank, who lives in Denver, and Hank looks a lot like me, and he talks a lot like me, and he actually has the same pickup truck and the same camper, same hunting rifle. His wife is named Kim, so I really tried to disguise everyone in the book. I made great efforts. She calls him and says, can I borrow your camper and a few of your guns? We're going to go to Yellowstone. So they fly out, they pick up the camper, they start driving to Wyoming, and here is what it's like in the truck. Celine didn't really relax until they turned up into the Sweetwater Valley, and the ranges on either side got close, and their flanks were dark with timber, and the meadows were green. So were the irrigated fields of the ranches lying along the river, the neat white ranch houses peeking out from groves of boisterous cottonwoods. She opened her window and let the late afternoon wind pour in, and it smelled of alfalfa and wet fields and the river. They drove into Lander just as the sun was setting into the long escarpment of the Wind Rivers. Just 3 more latitudes north made a difference here at the end of September. The air pouring through the window was chilly with fall, and she could smell wood smoke. The aspen were already turning on the higher ridges, slashing the shoulders of the mountains with ochre and gold. Glorious this time of year. It was good to be out of the city now, good to be rolling, traveling, letting her losses toss in her wake. The cold currents would bring them around again, surely, probably tonight as she slept. And if she woke up to the strange silences of a new town and lay in the dark listening, she would welcome them home and taste without bitterness the oddly sweet grief of missing those one loves. But now it was wonderful to forget for a few hours, to be traveling, to hear tires hum and thwop on cracks in the pavement, to come to a T in the road above a creek whose meadow was dotted with horses, roans and Appaloosas, and smell smoke from the wood of trees that didn't even grow in the east. Celine didn't feel like cooking. Pa offered, but she waved him off. "Let's have ribs," she said. "Isn't that what they eat in Wyoming? And then let's go find a pullout somewhere to make our new home. I feel a little like a hermit crab." Carrying his house on his back? "We had one as a pet, you know. Mimi brought it home from Simmons Point one day in her glasses case. Mummy had a fit. You were all suckers for a stray." He was not at all a stray. I'm sure she plucked him from a very fine family where he'd been quite happy. It made me mad. Kind of a lesson for me in not offering help where it isn't needed. "Did you make her put him back?" "No, she was irrationally attached. At the end of the summer, I abducted him and put him right back in the little tidal pool where she'd found him. I'd been with her that day. Anyway, over the summer, he'd been quite spoiled. She dropped all manner of food into the pickle jar. One Friday night, she brought him to the movies. She swore to me that he crawled to the edge of the jar and came half out of his shell and watched. Ginger Rogers. She swore on the Bible that he moved all his little legs like he wanted to dance. She said he was an almond and wasn't allowed to dance. I finally figured out that she meant Amish. I had learned about them from our nanny, and I'd been telling her about how they didn't have zippers, which she thought was hysterical. She changed Benny's salt water twice a day. When it was clear that he was actually growing, she found several empty snail shells and dropped them in. He expected them and found them lacking. I told her that probably they couldn't have holes. She thought he'd like to have windows in his new house. Finally, she found a beautiful, glossy, symmetrical shell all covered in irregular black spots like a paint pony and with no pinholes. Benny took one look and moved right in. Years and years later, as an adult, she told me she thought of that as one of her proudest moments. Isn't that odd? Pete half smiled. It was his way of giving vigorous applause. Finally, he said, "I always thought of ribs as a Texas specialty or Louisiana, though come to think of it, Uncle Norwich could barbecue a wicked batch." Were you even listening? Of course you were. His son Norwich Jr. kept a pet lobster one summer. That one didn't end so well. Ha! How could she have doubted him? Of all the things Pete Beveridge was very good at, listening was perhaps the best. "Maine ribs," she said. "You know, Pete, I've been cutting you slack all afternoon. I'm supremely aware." This was how they sparred. It was a call and response, a little like the cries red-tailed hawks screed across a valley to their mates. "Are you there?" "Yes, I am here." They passed the Pronghorn Lodge and came down the hill onto Main Street, a straight mile-long prospect of mostly late 19th century brick buildings with tall front windows and ornate front doors. They passed the Lander Grill and the Noble Hotel and 2 outdoor sports shops with tents and fleeced-up mannequins. They passed a loaf and jug and the Safeway and a gas station-turned burger joint and 2 stores featuring Native American crafts. It was that time of day or night that happens only a few weeks a year at a certain hour in certain parts of the American West. The sun sets behind mountains, but the cloudless sky that is more than cloudless, it is lens clear, clear as the clearest water, holds the light entirely, holds it in a bowl of pale blue as if reluctant to let it go. The light refines the edges of the ridges to something honed, and the muted colors of the pines on the slopes, the sage-roughened fields, the houses in the valley. The colors pulse with the pleasure of release, as if they know that within the hour they too will rest. Maybe Celine thought this way because she was exhausted. She was. It had been a long time since she'd driven that far in a day. Main Street curved to the right, and they passed the Double Ought Motel, which made them laugh, as there were probably patrons doing things in there they doubly ought not to do. And Celine abruptly threw the wheel over and executed a U-turn that startled Pa and squealed the tires. Practice, she smiled. 27 miles per hour, pretty good. Didn't even think about rolling. Never know when we might need one of those. I was thinking we ought to head back to the Lander Grill. They might not have ribs, but I bet they serve a mean steak. So, thanks. So I'm going to read one paragraph at the end. That's the end of the torture. The secret of this book is that it's about my mom. My mom, like Celine, was born in Paris before the war to American parents. Her dad was a banker who was there working in Paris. And a couple of months before the Germans marched on the city, they fled and they came to Manhattan. And my mother only spoke French, her and her two sisters. And my grandmother told me that all little Caroline Caro, wanted to do was go back to Europe and be in the fight in the French resistance at age 7. And she'd go around Manhattan listening to groups of people talking, and try and figure out who was a Nazi spy. So very early on, she had this sort of special ops bent. And then she went to school, she went to college, and got married right out of college the way a lot of women in her generation did. And then I came along and probably squelched her ambitions to join the CIA. I'm actually not sure of that. That's another story. But she raised me and my two sisters, and after we had come up a little bit, she started working for a detective agency, and she got her PI license and almost immediately was contacted by the FBI. They had wanted to catch a guy who perpetrated a large fraud on the Bank of New York, and they didn't have anyone. They thought his family was from Southern Connecticut, and they didn't really have a special agent who could go mingle with this, the set in Old Greenwich. So somehow they heard about my mom and they called her up. She made 2 phone calls and found the guy. His aunt played tennis with her aunt over in Woodstock, right over here. And she went up in her old Volvo and spied on him at his horse property with opera glasses. No kidding, this is true. And she was very proud of herself. And then this guy kind of came out. He got in this sports coupe and took off, and she followed him. And they had a high-speed car chase around Darien. I mean, it might have been 45 miles an hour, I don't know, but it sounded fast. And the guy, she was tenacious, she stayed on him, and finally the guy was like, who is this woman who can barely see over the steering wheel? And she's on me, why is she following me? He pulled over, and my mom got out, and I put the scene in the book because it's so great. She got out, and here, click, 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 the pumps on the pavement. She came over and she said, Franklin, what you're doing is wrong. And it's not good for you, and it's not good for your family, and you need to make this right. And so what we're going to do is I'm going to follow you back to the house, and then we'll drive together down to the Bank of New York, and we'll settle this thing. And he did. Because my mother's moral authority was inarguable, which is something that I found often growing up. And she trained hard to be the best PI she could. And she didn't do too many perp cases after that, because she said that this guy's face when they put the cuffs on him was something that she never wanted to see again. She thought it was so heartbreaking. I don't think I would have minded, actually, but she didn't like that. And but she did train hard, and she would go off. I remember, when I was younger, she would go off for a couple of weeks at a time, and often we weren't quite sure what she was up to. But it would get revealed later on in odd places. And so I put this scene in the book, too, with that afternoon when Mimi died. It was not her real name, but in Idaho, we were driving through Haley. My mother, we were both sad, and we didn't say much. And my mom said, "Hey, pull over, would you?" And the sign said, "Discount guns." I was like, all right. So we pulled over, and she walked into this place. Click, click, click. The guy in the back counter was cleaning a handgun on a cloth. He had it apart, and he's like watching her. She had a silk scarf on. And she came up to the counter, and she was looking at the handguns, and she said, "Could I see that one, please?" And it was a Navy Colt 45 semi-automatic. It's a big honking handgun. And the guy said, "You might want to," well, first he said, "It's a gift." And only I would have known that this little eyebrow thing was like looks could kill, right? She said, "No, it's for me." And he said, "You might want to start with the 22s over here. They're a lot lighter and easier." And she said, I'd like to see this one, please." And so he pulled it out, checked it, handed it to her, and she made a stance. I'll never forget, she made a stance at the wall, and the guy, I could just almost see the thought bubble in the cartoon, thought bubble, and the guy was like, she must watch a lot of cop shows. Pretty good stance. And then he was so intrigued, he was like, heck, I'm closing up in like 20 minutes anyway. Let's go shoot this thing. So we got in Dick Roop's Bronco and drove above Haley and got to this gully. There's a party spot, and there was a log, and he picked up a bunch of bottles and cans, like 7 of them. He lined them up, and then he told my mom, how to rack the gun and to be careful. She was very polite. And then she picked up the thing and just went bam, 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 bam. And the last can, fell, and she hit it again and put it up in the air. And the guy, you could not have caricatured this guy's face. I mean, Norman Rockwell would not have done it justice. He was just like, and he called her Carol on the way home, which I thought was really sweet, instead of Mrs. Heller. And he modified the grips for her. And when she died 2.5 years ago, we found that. We opened her little safe there in Brooklyn, and there were 7 handguns. One was that 45. She had a Lady Smith, and she had a Walther PPK, like the one James Bond uses, and she had a little Saturday Night Special to put in her boot. She was a badass. Who knew? I didn't know what to do with them. When we found all these guns, and it's legal to have them in Colorado, but it's not legal to step out of the front door with them. She had a permit, but I didn't. So being me, I got a cardboard box and some newspaper, and I packed them all, and then I walked up to Montague Street with the box, and I took it to UPS, and the guy said, "Okay, what's in here?" And I said, "Mementos." And then I went home, flew back to Denver, and I waited for like a week for the ATF to like bust down my door, and they didn't. The guy delivered the box, and there they were. So anyway, so I tried to. I think my mom died 2.5 years ago, and she was. I was really close with her, and. I think, it was a strange relationship, because I don't think most men feel like their mothers have more interesting lives than they do. So it was an inversion of sort of the normal relationship. And I was devastated when she died. And I think I wrote the book just sort of to hang out with her for, another year, which was really great. I tried to write her as closely as I could. I don't think I did that well, but I tried. And so I think I'm just going to open it up to some questions. That's the funnest thing, and so don't be shy. I know you all up in here in New England, you're all kind of shy. But don't be reserved. Don't mind if you heckle me. You can take it.
I got a question.
Yeah.
What got this all started for you? When you did Dog Stars first book, what was it, a specific thing that kind of got you rolling on it, or did you were you inspired by people or person and you had to get it out, or was there something go on in your life? And what got it all rolling for you?
I think it got rolling when I was like, 11, listening to my dad read to me. I wanted to write fiction. I remember I was walking around my library, my little school in Brooklyn Heights when I was 11, and I had a crush on the librarian. Her name was Annie Bosworth, and she was English. And I would have married her for how she said my name. She said, "Peter, are you looking for something to read?" And I was like, uh-huh. And a great librarian, like a great bookseller, who's followed your reading, ever since I was 5, knew what I was ready for. And she walked over to the fiction shelf and she pulled off Hemingway's In Our Time, that slim little book of short stories, mostly Nick Adams stories up in Michigan. And I took it home, and you got a picture of an 11-year-old kid in Brooklyn taking that home, and I opened it up, and I just, my heart leapt out of my chest. I wanted to hop off a slow freight train up in burned out forest in Michigan and have a rucksack and walk through grass that wet my pant legs would do, and camp by the big two-hearted river and make cowboy coffee. I didn't know what that was, but it sounded awesome. And I wanted to not burn my tongue the way Nick didn't burn his tongue on the coffee. And I wanted to fish for those beautiful, beautiful trout. And like in the end of something, that beautiful story, I wanted to have a girlfriend who could row and fish like a man. I thought that was so awesome. And then I wanted to break up with her because Nick did. I still don't know why he did that. She was great. I think it's probably because she was too good for him. But mostly, I wanted to write the way this guy did, because as I was reading the stories, when you read prose that you just adore, how it sort of doesn't come through your head, it comes through something else, like your skin, and it goes straight inside. That's how it felt to me. I just loved reading those stories, and I thought, I want to do that. And, I did everything I thought of to be a great writer when I was growing up. I heard that Jack London put words that he didn't know up on the wall. I did that. I read the dictionary. Imagine a 12-year-old kid reading the dictionary. I mean, that's like unnatural. I copied out poems and stories. I did all that stuff. Went to a good school, college across the river. And they didn't tell me at the English department that you can't make a living writing short stories and poetry. And I thought that was kind of mean of those guys. They probably should have told you. I got out thinking, I'd make a living doing that. And I think Guns and Ammo magazine rejected my first story about elk hunting. And I went to Boulder because our friend Landis was living there. He had a house there. And he said, "Hey, it's really cheap. Come live with me." And I had to, I was doing every job, and I had to make a living, and so I started writing for magazines. My friend Sasha, who a lot of you know, we were skiing one day. He would always get me a free ticket. I was like delivering pizza at night and teaching kayaking, and he would get me a free ticket on Mondays. So I went skiing, and I remember him driving, and he said, "Hey, look, you spend all day in the room, writing poems and stuff, and you're kayaking all the time. Why don't you combine your interests? Why don't you write for Outside Magazine?" And being young and dumb, I didn't know what I couldn't do. Just saying. So I went down to the magazine store, and I got an Outside Magazine. I looked at the masthead, and I found the name of a senior editor that sounded nice, Laura Honhold. Sounds nice, right? And I called out. I got the main number, 800. Called, and the receptionist picked up, and I said, "Laura Honnold, please." And she said, "Just a minute." And I was like, "Oh crap!" And then it was like, "Laura here," and then I just started talking really fast, and I said, "Hey, I'm a kayaker. I can kayak class 5, and I can write like the wind. I had a short story in Harper's, which was sort of true, and what was in the reading section is a little reprint of a Dartmouth, little creative writing magazine. It was in the, but it was in there, right? And I think you should send me on an expedition to the Tibetan Plateau to do this first ascent." And there was this like incredulous pause. And then she said, "We've heard heard about that expedition, and we don't have a writer that can kayak class 5, and so I'm going to take a chance on you, and I'm going to pay half your expenses. And if you write a good story, I'll pay the other half, and I'll buy the story. I went on the trip, and a lot of you know the story, but a guy died on the first day, and he died in my arms. He went into a log jam, and I was the kayaker with another guy, and we couldn't get him out, and the river rose over his head, and he was on his honeymoon. And so I was devastated by that, and I came back. His wife had him cremated a few days later, and she went back home with the ashes. And we, the next morning, went back to the river, which had been in flood from big heavy rains, and now the river was down, and it was beautiful again. It was really strange. We had a little memorial for David, and I had a book of poems from Tang Dynasty poets, and I thought on my first assignment I'll bring a book of poetry from the place to get the soul of the place. I've done that ever since, and I read one at this. We sang Amazing Grace, and I read this poem, and then we spent 2 weeks just driving around the Tibetan Plateau in a place that had been closed to Westerners since 1959. It was like a sort of dream. We were all traumatized and grief-stricken, and I came home and I told Laura that I couldn't write her story. I'm sorry, and she said, "What happened?" And I started venting. I know I was like really grieving, and she said, "You go write that, and I'll see what I can do." And I wrote it, and I wrote this long story. They published it, and it was their submission for the National Magazine Awards that year, and it was an odd way to start in journalism, but it sort of launched this career in adventure journalism, and I found that I could do what I loved so much, which was to go on adventures and to be on rivers and to be with other river runners. I just loved it. So it was like a joyful diversion away from what I grew up wanting to do. And you can't, in a way, it was like it was like the golden handcuffs in some ways, because you could not turn it down. It was like so awesome. But after doing that, for a long time, a few years ago, I had been writing for Business Week, and I had some money saved up, and I thought, it's time. I think I've got 9 months. And I went to my coffee shop, and I sat down, and first of all, I didn't know if you could just start. Did you need a plot or an outline? Or could you just start with the first line? I didn't know if that was even legal. If you just started, not with the fiction police, bust down your door kind of thing. And so I called my buddy, my best friend from Putney was named Carlton Hughes. And he's still a really dear friend. And he was in Hollywood. He was the producer for Lost and the showrunner and everything. And he's got 4 shows on TV right now. He's amazing. But he didn't seem that smart in high school, but he really was. I called him and I said, "Hey, Tony, do you know you work with all these novelists and stuff? Do you know anybody who just starts with the first line and has no clue?" And he said, "Oh yeah, I've worked with Stephen King. He often starts with the first line, and that's a voice, and a voice is a character, and a character's in a place, and the place there's a situation, because there's always a situation. And then he writes into the story." And then he said something that really surprised me. He said, "Elmore Leonard. I worked with Elmore Leonard, and he often starts with the first line." And I thought that was so cool. So it was he gave me permission. I was like, "Thanks." And I went to my coffee shop, and I sat down, and I wrote, "I keep the beast running. I keep the low lead on tap. I foresee attacks." And a few lines later, "My name is Hig, one name, Big Hig if you need another. If I ever woke up crying in the middle of a dream," and I'm not saying I did, "it's because the trout are gone, every one." And as soon as I wrote that, as soon as he said that, I was like, okay, I'm listening. Speak, and he started speaking, and it was like this guy was on the other side of a campfire on an October night with the wind blowing the flames around. He was just telling me what happened to him a couple of years before. And I would just go sit down every day. This was just 5 years ago. And I thought every day I sat down, I thought, just don't think, just listen. Don't think, just listen. And he spoke it. It was the most thrilling thing I'd ever experienced. Of all the adventures I've been on and everything else, it was awesome. And I got to the end of the novel, and just to sort of bring that full circle, I got to the last page, and it was the poem that I had read for David 25 years before by the river. It came out of nowhere. And it's called When Will I Be Home? And it's by Li Shang Yin from the 9th century. It goes, when will I be home? I don't know. In the mountains, in the rainy night, the autumn lake is flooded. One day, we will be back together again. We will sit in the candlelight by the west window, and I will tell you how I remembered you tonight on the stormy mountain. It's so crazy. I mean, fiction is so cool. It's this vessel for everything that you don't even know you know. It just, so wonderful. I love writing fiction, for that reason. That was the short answer.
Got my money's worth out of that one.
Next time I'll go into it more. Yeah.
I'm thinking about Jack London and Martin Eden, and I'm thinking, how do you balance the physical rigors and the exhaustion that often ensues with the need to be sharp and attentive and put your time in writing after a long day doing any number of these menial physical jobs you've done over your career?
Yeah, I mean, like oftentimes I would, I would do those jobs like being your gardener. Remember that for $8 an hour?
Pulling sumac trees out of the ground, yeah.
But often, I mean, back then, when I was doing those jobs, I would often, do those one day and then, write poetry or stories on another day. But when I was delivering pizza and stuff in Boulder, I thought delivering pizza was like the greatest job on earth. I really couldn't believe how cool it was because, I mean, you just showed up and they gave you this extra large jacket because I always came at like 8 to Domino's and all the guys took all the regular mediums. So I was in like this extra large Domino's, red and blue, and this big hat. Like you basically disappear, it's like cool. You're like anonymous, like and they give you an address, and you just like drive there as fast as you can. It's like almost licensed to run, stoplights and stuff. And you give them their pizza and they give you a tip, and it's and then you have your days free. I thought it was kind of awesome. So I did write when I was doing that. Now I write 1,000 words a day every day. I heard Jack London. You learn so much from these guys who've done it before and done it well. I heard Jack London. I heard Graham Greene wrote 500 words every day of his life, and he would write on his friend's yacht in the Mediterranean, in the deck chair with those round sunglasses. He would write in the Raffles Hotel in Singapore. He would write in London in his apartment. He wrote 500 words every day. Can you imagine? And he was so assiduous about it that he had, he'd write in a little notebook and he'd keep a subtotal in the margin. And when he hit word 500, he stopped. And it could be in the middle of a sentence, in the middle of dialogue, in the middle of a love scene. Imagine, in End of the Affair, he would stop. And I realized, I thought about that, and I thought, what he's doing is stopping in the middle. Because by setting an arbitrary amount, it's, most of the time he's going to be stopping right in the middle of something. And I thought, that's going to be really great for his momentum, because he's going to want to get up in the morning and keep going and finish. And I realized that I don't do that. And none of my I've had a lot of author friends, and none of them work like that. We all of us, would write a scene, and we get excited about it and say, we all have our like quota. Like some of us write 2 hours or 3 hours, or some of us write 500 words, or some write 1,000. We all have these like little quotas that we try and get done. But if we're on a scene that's exciting us, we'll go on, we'll write 2,000, 3,000 words, we'll just keep going until we finish the scene, we'll finish the scene, and go, whew, gosh, that was good, and then go on with the rest of our day. But if you think about it, that's a transition, that's a double return, that's white space. So every morning, you know, I would come back to white space. You have to start the book over every day, you know, roll the rock up the hill again. And I realized, wow, he didn't do that. And so what I started to do was write my 1,000 words, but I would go past it until I was right in the middle of a scene, or if it's an essay, a thought, until it's in the middle of something really exciting, and then I stop. So if it's 1,060 words or whatever. And it was amazing. It changed my relationship to my work, because I just couldn't wait to get up in the morning. You know, it was like, because I was always in the middle. And when I had the energy to, like, I had so much energy, I knew I could write 3,000 words, I would make myself stop right there, right around the 1,000. And that generated so much, I mean, you garner so much energy doing that every day. And that, you know, for running the marathon of a novel, and a novel's a real marathon, you know, it's not a mile. And so it's an awesome method, you know, that, I just love it. So sometimes, you know, if I'm excited, it'll take an hour, you know, to do that, and sometimes it'll take 4 hours, but I just do. Yeah.
Well, I've read the book twice, and I love it. Beautiful.
Twice.
And So my question is, and especially now after you've given this talk and given some more background, especially your affinity with poetry, at the beginning of the story you quote Sunday morning, just a little fragment of it. But after, and I love a book that will send me off in other places. Oh, it references something, so I'll go and read that, or I'll look in the dictionary. I'm a dictionary person too. I'm also a librarian.
Oh, love you.
In Woodstock.
Wow.
And so I just, when I read Sunday morning and went back and reread the book the second time, I just was wondering how maybe that poem informed the book a little bit more broadly than just that one scene after 9/11 or Salim's loss. And if it did, maybe it didn't.
Yeah, I don't know if authors are the right person to ask. You know, it's like, it's so funny because I think most of us really don't know what the heck we're doing. I mean, some of us are smart enough later on to pretend that we meant to do certain things, or we've made conscious decisions to, intertwine certain themes in certain ways in a very elegant way. I never could pull that off, pretending like I couldn't look someone in the eye and be so deceitful. Yeah, I think what happens is, I think of writing like a sport, and I think you spend so many hours all alone in a room in Boulder, delivering pizza at night, but you spend so many hours writing stories and so many writing poetry, and you start to get a feeling for, like an athlete, you can kind of feel like when you're heading towards a cul-de-sac and you kind of make it go the other way. It's like it's kind of like riding a mountain horse is one way when I'm actually rolling. The training is like training like an athlete. You just train and train and train, and then hopefully, when you're in your NBA, semifinal game, you're just all fluid and you're in the zone and you don't think, but all the plays that you studied and all the training you did, come together. And I think a lot of times for writers that have been writing all their lives, and I think you hope that's what happens. So there's a lot of stuff that's going on underneath the surface that you don't realize that's going on. And it's like riding a mountain horse. Like I once took a long trip on a pack trip with a horse that knew way more than I did. He was a 20-year-old outfitting horse. His name was Dandy. And he would actually, like, at the end of the day, when he was tired, he would see a crossbar for hanging deer in a fire ring, and he'd just turn in and stop. He'd say, okay, it's time to camp. I'd be like, well, you know better than me, But he would, if you get lost or anything, you give a mountain horse's head, and you just let him go, and that's what it feels like when you're writing. You just sort of let the story, let the character. You just sort of give up authorial control and you just let it run. But a horse has a brain the size of a chestnut or whatever it has, grapefruit or whatever it is, and you're a human being, supposedly little more, and every once in a while the horse wants to go down into like a arroyo, and you just know that that's a bad idea, so you just nudge him over. Because you've been written all those stories, you can feel when the energy's falling off, or you can feel when a certain dog, it's just not gonna end well. So you just nudge it over here, get him back going, and then you give him his rein again and let it go again. So it's just like give and take of authorial control. It's a very interesting process. It's really fun, and it takes a while to find the balance of when to. So I don't know how I got into that. Yeah.
I was curious if you could just talk a little bit more about the process of how you create the settings. So I grew up in Lander. As you read through it,
did I make him stay?
No, you didn't. They painted this just perfect picture for me. But I'm just curious, as you create these settings, are you going through these places personally? Or are you going through the places and then you write afterwards or during, or how does that happen?
Yeah, I did so many assignments, like adventure stories and environmental stories and stuff. And I trained myself, rigorously to always keep track of little details that could make a story come alive or a scene come alive, because I really believe in setting. And I really believe that it's very, very important to establish a sense of place for your reader right away. And the analogy I use for that, like when I'm talking to students, is like how many people have had a rescue dog? Has anybody taken a rescue dog? Yeah. Okay. So, how's the dog when you pick it up from the shelter and you put it in the car? How's the dog? The dog is he's probably might be shaking. It's looking at you. It wants to trust you. It wants to love you, but it's not quite sure, and it doesn't really like being in the car. You take it. And you take it home and you give it a sense of place. You give it a home and you give it food and love, and you create a place of trust. Then you take that dog and you go, saddle up, jumps in the car, and you can drive across the country with that dog, right? It'll go anywhere you want. So I feel like the reader, it's sort of like you give the reader right away a sense of place, which means you give them sense data, like you give them as many of the 5 senses as you can, right off, so that because readers trust senses much more than the brain stuff. So you give them, a sense of place right away, and then you take their hand, and then they'll follow you into the narrative. And so sense of place was always very important to me. Even when I was writing, sometimes when I wrote for Business Week, business articles, I would try and give the reader a sense of place, believe it or not, because they had much more fun reading my stories than the ones that didn't. And so to create a sense of place, you got to it's like you're on a creek. It's like the pollen dusting the eddy. Or the light gleaming down a spider web in the roots of a tree on the bank. Those are those little details that make the thing come alive. And so I train myself to watch for those. And so when I go back, I've been through Lander lots of times, and been through Yellowstone, I've been through, and so I've been through Cook City, and but when I was there, I didn't even really know it. But by then, I'm seeing all these little details. What are the baronets doing against the sky? What are what are the black stains on the cliffs, and stuff. So I think it's just a matter of training, but it's fun, and if you haven't trained, and it's fun just to write down the stuff that no one else might notice. Yeah. Let's see, I have time for one more question. I'll do these two, yeah. Go ahead.
I was just, you talk a lot about training, and I was wondering how much of that you think came from your studies at Dartmouth and in your master's, and how much of that you just kind of taught yourself or learned along the way.
Yeah, so that's a really good question. I think, Dartmouth was so rigorous academically, and there's so much stuff that I wanted to do aside from go to class. These guys kind of.
No, you didn't come out of Dartmouth with any big sense of discipline. I can learn that later.
Wow, busted. Okay, so somewhere after Dartmouth, I got some discipline.
And he was able to blend in the training from athleticism.
Right. Yeah, I don't know. I'll tell you one thing. I went to a wedding once and I met John McPhee, who's the wonderful nonfiction writer. He's just amazing. And I asked him, this is something I'll never forget. I was so in awe. I kind of sat down next to him and I said, so I want to be a writer too. And, I just read Conversations with the Archdruid. Right.
Encounters with the Archdruid.
Encounters with the Archdruid. Oh my God, I better get that right. Like, this is family, so I can make a mistake like that. If I do that on NPR, I'm really screwed. Who is this idiot? Anyway, he wrote a book in which there's some dialogue with a guy going up, they're hiking up a mountain. And the dialogue is so authentic. And I asked him, I said, well, how do you get this authentic? This guy's like jumping off the page. He's so real and authentic. How do you do that? Do you like take notes while you're hiking, or something? Or do you like have such a good memory that you come back to camp and you write it down, you write down the conversation? He said, oh man. He said, if you come back to camp at the end of the day and try, all the dialogue will sound like you. And it won't sound authentic at all. I carry a little notebook with me, and I'm writing word for word what the guy's saying while I'm hiking. And even the ers and the ums and the coughs, because that's those rhythms, those cadences, that's what makes it real and what gives someone a personality, a feeling for the personality. So I took that to heart. And I would be on these expeditions. I would keep a dry bag between my legs and a kayak, and I'd pull into an eddy, in the middle of, and I would write down something I just heard, and when I was on Sea Shepherd, in Antarctica, we were big 30, 40-foot seas, and the ship's at 35, 40 degrees, and people are flying across the bridge. I had a little place between the radar table and the bulkhead where the windows were, and I could wedge in there and I write down everything everyone says while they're flying across, and I just be wedged in there, hands free, just writing and writing, and I came back with 1,600 pages of notes, tons of dialogue, but that was such a great trick, such a great tip, and it's, those kinds of things are, good to do. So, so I don't know. I grad school, I don't think, you can't learn to write at grad school. I went to Iowa because there were 50 people who thought poetry was the most important thing on earth, and that's what was valuable. The books that we traded and the passion for it. So, yeah. Okay, one more.
So, detective stories as a genre are known for their plot twists, blind alleys, and all that kind of stuff. Did you chart any of that out, differently than your other books, or did you just let it all flow?
No, I didn't, because I can't do it. I wrote so much nonfiction, Carrie, that, I always knew what was going to happen next in nonfiction because it happened, and I always knew what the ending was going to be. And, when I'm writing fiction, I finally can do what I've wanted to do since I was a kid. I want to be as surprised as the reader. I want to have as much fun as the reader. I don't want to know what's going to happen. So sometimes in my head I sort of block. I remember in The Painter, I remember thinking, okay, well, he's going to go to Santa Fe to do this commission. Should the vengeful brother, be chasing him? That's about as far as it went, There's no whiteboard, no pins and a map, anything like that. So yeah, I just sort of let it rip and then deal with the mess at the end. There's a lot that happens in revision, and that's the great thing because you can revise, it's awesome. So yeah, good question. Okay, you get one tiny few lines and then I'll cut you loose. The saddest part was that parents would keep disappearing and children would cry themselves to sleep night after night for months, for years. And that mothers would have their babies taken from them before they had a chance to smell the tuft of soft hair, their ears, before they had a chance to say, oh, how I love you, forever and ever. That the baby was taken before she had a chance to kiss her and wrap her properly in her arms. Pete guided her around a deep pothole, partly filled with gravel, and she gripped his hand more tightly. In the wan light from the motel sign, she could see their truck, the only vehicle in the drive, the only guest. At the end of the street, she could see the dark bulk of the baronet rising against the night sky. Yes, sad, how it felt. She thought that one might not make a dent in the great sadness, but one could help make another person whole. Thank you so much for coming.